Many tic-tacs later. One long angry line later. A lot of boring math later. Later, in the void. One frozen wasteland later. Meanwhile, back in the lowlands. Meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab. Several bad puns later. One debt to society later. 3,000 whoop-whoos later. 2 very boring minutes later. 1 pair of pants later. Meanwhile. Previously. Later. 298 frozen patties later. Later. Just then. Later. 11 minutes later. 15 minutes later. 20 minutes later. 5 minutes later. 5 minutes later. 5 minutes later. 346 minutes later. A few minutes later. 1 minute 37 seconds later. Montage. 1 week later. 1 week later. 2 weeks later. 3 weeks later. 3 weeks later. 4 to 6 weeks later. A little longer than a few minutes later. 3 days later. 3 days later. 3 days later. 3 days later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
4 to 6 more days later. 2 days later. 4 to 6 days later. Several days later. Later that same evening. Tomorrow. Yesterday. Day 3. The next day. The next day. Day 2. The next day. Early the next morning. 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 16 paranoia-filled days later. The very next evening. The following day. Day 4. 1 hour later. 1 hour later. 1 hour later.
1 hour later!
24 hours later. 24 hours later. 2 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 hours later. 3 hours later. 3 hours later. 48 hours later. 5 hours later. 6.5 hours later. 6 hours later. 6 hours later. 72 hours later. 3 hours later.
Can you move it along? I'm all out of time cards.
7 hours later. 8 hours later. 8 hours later. Many unbearable hours later. Approximately 10 hours later. Many hours later. Just then. 3,000 years later. 2,000 years later. 75 years later. Opening night. Much later. Much later. Much later. Much later. The following Thursday. 3:28 a.m.
70 years later.
8:01 p.m. 7:59 a.m. Tomorrow for sure. Eventually 12 o'clock midnight. 6 months later. Several months later. Many months later. Graduation day. Moments later. Moments later. More moments later. 10 seconds later. 12 seconds later. By sheer coincidence. Epilogue. Flashback. End of flashback. What follows is a brief construction montage. We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage. 82 kilometers later. 1 winter later. 1 semester later. 1 eternity later. 1 shift later.
80,000 impressions later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying. A little later. Soon after. 1 extremely annoying shift later. A few inches later. Thousands of tears later. A few moments later. Several song-filled hours later.